Rome is home to layers upon layers of history. Over 1 million people lived here 2,000 years ago, surrounded by concrete apartment blocks and running water, while most other human settlements at the time struggled to house 20,000. According to legend, the city's very first act was a murder inside the founding family. Twin brothers Romulus and Remus were supposedly raised by a wolf, returned to the area to build a city, and fell into a bitter dispute over which hill to build it on. Romulus killed his brother, named the city after himself, and set a brutal precedent for the centuries to come. After 2 centuries of rule by kings, the Roman nobility snapped under a cruel leader named Tarquin the Proud. In 509 BC, they threw out the monarchy entirely. In its place, they built a republic, a government designed to share power by electing 2 leaders, called consuls, who were legally forced to step down after a single year. But the wealthy noble families kept a tight grip on the actual decision-making, leaving ordinary citizens, the plebeians, with nothing. So in 494 BC, the working class tried a radical tactic. They walked out of Rome, camped on a nearby hill, and refused to fight in the army or do any work. Without soldiers to defend the walls, the elites were forced to negotiate, eventually granting ordinary citizens legally protected representatives. By creating the tribune of the plebs, a position designed specifically to protect ordinary people from elite abuse, Rome established a pattern of absorbing internal tension into its legal system. Instead of the city splitting apart, these early conflicts forced the Republic to build more flexible, resilient institutions. By the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled the Italian peninsula, but they ran into a massive competitor across the Mediterranean. Carthage was a wealthy North African city that dominated the western sea routes, making a collision between the 2 expanding powers inevitable. That collision brought Rome face to face with Hannibal, a Carthaginian general who pulled off one of history's most audacious military maneuvers. In 218 BC, he marched an entire army, complete with dozens of war elephants, out of Spain, through southern France, and straight over the Alps in the dead of winter to attack Italy from the north. This tactical map shows the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal's smaller force managed to completely encircle a massive Roman army of 80,000 men. In a single afternoon, between 50 and 70,000 Romans died. The shock in the capital was total, yet the Senate flatly refused to negotiate for peace. They armed freed slaves, adjusted their field tactics to exhaust Hannibal's supply lines, and eventually invaded North Africa to force his retreat. By the time they burned Carthage to the ground in 146 BC, Rome had demonstrated a capacity for total, ruthless mobilization that no other power in the Mediterranean could match. Expanding across the sea made Rome incredibly rich, but that immense wealth broke the Republic's fragile power-sharing rules. Aristocrats bought up enormous tracts of land and farmed them with cheap slave labor brought back from conquered territories. Small farmers lost their livelihoods. Soon, ambitious generals started paying their troops directly, creating private military forces loyal to them rather than the state. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar took his loyal troops and crossed the Rubicon River, a legal boundary marking an act of open rebellion against the Roman state. He took control, declared himself dictator for life, and prompted a group of senators to stab him 23 times in 44 BC. Instead of saving the Republic, his assassination triggered the final civil wars that destroyed it entirely. Out of the ashes emerged Caesar's adopted heir, Augustus, who established 2 centuries of relative stability known as the Pax Romana. Look at this map of the empire at its peak under Emperor Trajan. The territory stretched roughly 5 million square kilometers, reaching from the Scottish borders down to the Sahara, and stretching east all the way to the Persian Gulf. The sheer volume of resources pouring into the capital financed engineering marvels that defy time. The Pantheon, rebuilt under Emperor Hadrian, features an enormous, unreinforced concrete dome with an open central eye to let in natural light. 19 centuries later, it remains perfectly intact. By consolidating all authority into the hands of an emperor, Rome reached its absolute height in architecture and global reach. But the survival of the entire state now depended entirely on the competence of the single man sitting at the top. During the 3rd century, a vicious cycle of plagues, civil wars, and economic crashes nearly tore the state apart. To manage the unmanageable scale, the territory was divided. Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople, leaving the western half exposed. This became fatal when nomadic Huns arrived from the Central Asian steppes. Their advance pushed Germanic tribes westward, crashing through Rome's stretched frontier defenses. The pressure was simply too much. In 410 AD, the Visigoths marched into Rome and looted the city for 3 days, the first successful attack on the capital in 800 years. Then, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain quietly removed a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus from the throne. He didn't even bother to claim the imperial title for himself. He simply packed up the crown and shipped it east. Life in 476 AD continued without much visible drama. The local government kept running, and the borders remained porous. The collapse was a slow, decades-long erosion of central authority, where the state simply lost the financial and military capacity to manage its distant borders. Left behind by the shifting empire, the city's population collapsed from over 1 million down to perhaps 20,000. The magnificent public buildings fell apart, and centuries of dirt buried the Roman Forum, until locals used the heart of the ancient city as a grazing pasture for cows. But a new authority stepped into the political vacuum. As the power of emperors faded, the spiritual influence of the Catholic Church expanded. Popes replaced Caesars, transforming Rome from a military headquarters into a massive destination for religious pilgrims and sacred politics. By the Renaissance and into the Baroque period, the Church leveraged extreme wealth to completely redesign the urban landscape. Masterpieces like the Trevi Fountain were built directly on top of original, functioning ancient aqueducts, using artists and architects like Bernini to project massive cultural supremacy in stone and water. Rome achieved a new kind of longevity through this transition. As the possibility of military reconquest faded, the city used its symbolic status to become the spiritual and cultural heart of the West, physically building its new identity on top of its ancient foundations. Entering the 20th century, the city's ancient aesthetic was weaponized. Benito Mussolini seized power in 1922 and aggressively tore through medieval neighborhoods to construct intimidating, wide boulevards. He deliberately hijacked the imagery of imperial Rome to legitimize his fascist regime. The outbreak of the Second World War brought severe risk, but the Vatican's presence and the sheer historical value of the city largely spared it from the carpet bombing that leveled other European capitals. Even as the city was occupied by German forces and eventually liberated by the Allies, the ancient core remained standing. In the aftermath of the war, the city rapidly shook off its darkest chapter. Driven by Italy's post-war economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, Rome became a magnet for cinema and style, transitioning into the bustling, glamorous metropolis we recognize today. This is how a city originally built on conquest and slavery, shattered by centuries of time, manages to persist. Rome survives by physically absorbing its own history, stacking the Republic, the Empire, the Papacy, and the modern world directly on top of each other. Its ultimate legacy is a stubborn, spectacular refusal to be forgotten.